Introduction. Despite over a century of detailed investigation, the date of the Hebrew exodus from Egypt remains a topic of extensive debate within scholarship. Scholarly discussion focuses on exegetical concerns such as the interpretation of chronological data in the Old Testament, the correct identification of toponyms or place names, and the relationship between textual and archaeological data. This video summarizes the emergence of the two most commonly proposed dates, covering these topics. 1. History of competing dates. 2. Textual evidence. 3. Archaeological evidence. History of competing dates. Throughout the 19th century, Ramesses II was considered the pharaoh under whom the Hebrews were enslaved, and his son Merneptah the pharaoh of the Exodus. However, discovery of the Merneptah stele, which refers to Israel as a recognized people already settled in Canaan by the end of the 13th century, invalidated this view. Ralph K. Hawkins, professor of biblical and archaeological studies at Everett University in Virginia, writes, quote, "This new data appeared to require that Israel had already been settled there by the end of the 13th century BC." End quote. Consequently, Hawkins notes a revised interpretation emerged, identifying Ramesses II as the pharaoh of the Exodus, a view which Hawkins says remained dominant throughout the rest of the 19th century, up to the 1920s. However, in 1925, a 15th century date was proposed. Hawkins says the author of this view, James Jack, quote, argued that both biblical and extra-biblical evidence pointed to a mid-15th century BC date. End quote. Textual evidence. The early date of the mid-15th century BCE rests principally on an application of the chronology given in 1 Kings 6:1, which appears to date the Exodus 480 years before the reign of King Solomon. The text reads, quote, "In the 480th year after the Israelites left Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel, during the month Ziv, the second month, he began building Yahweh's temple." End quote. Since there is considerable agreement that Solomon's reign started at around 960 BCE, counting 480 years back from this date places the Exodus at approximately 1440 BCE. A second text seen as corroborating this early date is Judges 11:26, in which the judge Jephthah claims that Israel had already been in Canaan for at least 300 years. This text reads, quote, "Israel has been living in Heshbon and its nearby towns, in Aroah and its nearby towns, and in all the cities along the Arnon for 300 years." End quote. Hawkins observes that these two texts would appear to suggest an early date for the Exodus, writing, quote, "If 1100 BC is taken as an approximate date for Jephthah's activities, this would place the taking of the Transjordan under Moses, Numbers 21, around 1400 BC, about 40 years after the departure from Egypt." End quote. The late date also appears to receive textual support from Exodus 1:11, which refers specifically to the Hebrews building the store cities Pithom and Ramesses for the pharaoh. The text reads, quote, "So they put foremen over the Israelites to oppress them with hard labor. As a result, they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for the pharaoh." End quote. Unlike 1 Kings 6:1 and Judges 11:26, this text rests on an absolute rather than a relative date, the construction of buildings at Pithom and Ramesses. Archaeological evidence. In the absence of direct archaeological evidence for the Hebrew settlement in Goshen and the lack of Egyptian records describing the Hebrews as an enslaved ethnic group, or the plagues, or subsequent exodus, attempts to date the Exodus using archaeological evidence focused on dating the Hebrew entry into Canaan, searching for evidence of conquest. Attempts have been made by proponents for both dates, and interpretation of the archaeological record has been much contested. In the 1930s, archaeologist John Garstang's excavations of Tel es Sultan led him to conclude there was strong evidence for a Hebrew destruction of Jericho before 1400 BCE, lending weight to an early date exodus. Old Testament scholar R.K. Harrison notes Garstang's research was influential, writing, quote, Garstang's statement that Jericho had fallen before 1400 appeared to support the time frame of 1 Kings 6:1 and was received enthusiastically by supporters of the 15th century BC date. End quote. However, Harrison adds that archaeologist Kathleen Kenyon's subsequent investigation of the site, quote, found no trace of late Bronze Age walls, end quote, and consequently redated the destruction to around 1500 BCE, too early for the Hebrews. For decades, Dr. Bryant Wood, a conservative archaeologist and young Earth creationist, has defended Garstang's dating and attributed the destruction of Jericho to an early date Hebrew conquest. However, his arguments have not gained any significant scholarly acceptance outside evangelical and conservative Christian circles. Contemporary with Garstang, archaeologist William Albright arrived at a late date for the Exodus on the basis of his own investigations of Canaanite archaeological sites. Although Wood says, quote, the 13th century Exodus conquest theory was formulated by William F. Albright, end quote, we have already seen that this date was in fact first proposed at the end of the 19th century. In response to acknowledged difficulties harmonizing an early date with the archaeological record, in the 1970s, John Bimson proposed a Hebrew conquest during the end of the Middle Bronze Age, which seemed to fit the biblical record more closely. Old Testament scholar John Walton comments that Middle Bronze Age Canaan, quote, featured the massive and numerous walled cities that the books of Numbers and Joshua seem to suggest, and many of them were destroyed at the end of the period, end quote. However, Bimson's interpretation was critiqued strongly by many scholars. In particular, Walton describes how both Wilhelm Bietek and Baruch Halpern argued that Bimson's chronology, quote, could not possibly accommodate the archaeological data, end quote. In contrast, archaeological evidence for destruction and occupation layers supporting a late date exodus was considered more abundant. Harrison writes, quote, archaeological evidence from Canaanite sites such as Bethel, Debir, Lachish, and Hazor indicates destruction at 13th century BC levels, a fact generally regarded as relating to the Hebrew occupation under Joshua, end quote. He also adds, quote, evidence from Philistine sites tends to favor a late rather than an early date for the Exodus, end quote. Conclusion. By the 1970s, the date of the Exodus had ceased to become a significant concern within critical scholarship, as many commentators no longer believed in the essential historicity of the event. However, the issue continued to be debated hotly among evangelical and other faith-professing scholars, as well as among a minority report of critical scholars and those professional archaeologists who considered the biblical Exodus account to preserve an essentially accurate historical core. The second video in this series will compare and contrast the evidence and arguments advanced for each date, together with their respective counter-arguments.